That's fine then. Good. Yeah, so I will talk about extreme events. Well, in a changing climate, I think that's fairly obvious that we want to talk about that here. And the C3S approach from COP1 to COP2. One could summarize this presentation very quickly. So if you need a bit of a break, this is the takeaway message. We did a lot on extremes in COP1, but maybe not in a very concerted effort, rather because the extremes are very important across almost anything you do in a climate sense. So there's a lot of interest about extremes across the service, and I will go through some of those examples throughout my presentation. But we also realized that maybe it's a bit too dispersed and not very cohesive, so we kind of have to have a centralized kind of point of access. So a bit like the shop front that Peter was asking about before, of kind of saying, I'm interested in extremes, what information do you have on extremes within the service? So that's where we've identified some gaps, and we have some ideas of how to move things forward. But that's kind of the nutshell of this presentation in very brief. And I will start by going through some of the examples of what we did during COP1. So on the one hand, one thing that I was in charge of kind of at the end of COP1, so maybe the last year and a half, was the prototype extreme events and attribution service, where we looked into the possibility of having an operational service at C3S for climate change attribution, focusing mainly on heat waves and rainfall events. There was quite a lot of work that went into this, and there's a lot of material to be used from that specific exercise, and you'll see some of that material going through the presentation. But then also across the activities of the sectoral information systems, which you will hear more about in the next presentation, there are also examples of where extremes kind of become important. So you see one example down here of disaster risk reduction. So for instance, a data set on fire danger, so the extreme of fire, which was also very relevant this year. But also on the operational windstorm service, so this was more dedicated to the insurance industry. So if you're interested in insurance, you might kind of end up with this data set, but if you just come in and say, I want to know about extreme winds, you may not have the avenue in the kind of current setup. And here's another example of a case study in parts of France on extreme flooding. So you can find a lot of these on the website. And all these different activities led to a range of various outputs, starting by a number of data sets. Say, for instance, this windstorm case I talked about before resulted into 2 data sets for synthetic windstorm events. So this was a catalog of windstorm events updated until a certain point in time. And there's kind of discussions on how to potentially move this forward in the future. But then also the example that Gerard just talked about climate indices and climate extreme indices. We have those for EOPS, for past climate, but also for CMIP6, so for the climate projections going forward in time. So you kind of have this kind of way of looking at extremes by going into this data set. And there's a number of different data sets like these. Then if we move further down, we have a number of tools, so in the toolbox. And here is actually one of the few examples out of the prototype attribution activity, which is public and online. So for those who are familiar with the attribution activities, they were mainly led by Geert Jan for a long time. You most likely will recognize these graphics. They do not come from the Climate Explorer. They're actually derived within the CDS toolbox. So a number of those tools were ported onto the CDS and into the toolbox. If we then move on, some of these activities also led to applications. So here are 2 examples, one on extreme precipitation on the top left, and one on the fire danger, which I talked about before. And what I want to say about these applications and many of these data sets is that a lot of them, especially the ones that kind of concern monitoring going back in time, are not necessarily updated in near real time at the moment. So this is part of kind of the identified gap, and to decide which ones of these do we need to have in near real time, and what does near real time mean? Because that can also mean different things for both the different people, and also in terms of what processing is needed. And then, this is confidential. This is one thing that kind of exists internally in terms of developed products. It's the extreme events catalog, so one way of displaying the results from this attribution activity. At the moment, it's extremely confidential because it's on a virtual machine in Bologna, but that has not yet been reactivated after the move. So this is from an old presentation of mine. But I just wanted to mention that these are kind of a lot of building blocks which we can rely on to kind of reconstruct and redecide how we do structure this extreme events activity. From the attribution activity, there were also a lot of protocols, how to do certain things and what workflows to use. And I think this is actually extremely important when we think about these things about being nimble. It's very easy to say, let's be nimble and let's have everything in place. But if you don't have kind of specific workflows of who will do what at what time, it might not be exactly one person, but this team will be addressed, or they are in charge of doing that. It's very difficult to be nimble, unless you're a one-person show, and we do have one such one in-house, but maybe not forever. So they are there, and I think we should make use of them to kind of build upon them and expand or kind of adapt them. And then, as already mentioned by Gerard and also by Julian, we also have further downstream things. So this summer, indeed, if you just go to the newsreel on our webpage, you will see 2 news articles about heat waves in the summer. And if you go further down in the news, you will find more of those, probably published about, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks after the event. And then also a lot of examples of addressing extreme events in the European State of the Climate, but of course usually with, well, it depends on when they happen in the year, but between a year to, let's say, 3 to 4 months delay after the event happened. And here there are also a number of resources available for us so far internally, from the extreme attribution prototype, which is more on the educational side, so what do we actually know about certain events in a changing climate. So there are a lot of things that we have produced during COP1 that relate to extreme events, but if you come to the website looking for information about extreme events, you may not exactly find them because they're quite a few steps down compared to these. So this is a puzzle by Jan van Haasteren. It's a very nice Dutch puzzle makers. If you like puzzles, I can recommend them. It's a nice, relaxing exercise, actually, to try to puzzle these pieces together. And of course, in this shop, we also kind of found some empty shelves. So even though there's a lot of building blocks from COP1, there are also a number of things to kind of fill gaps to actually kind of restructure this extreme events activities. And here I will show you one of my favorite signs that sometimes is on display in the Shinfield offices of, so in Reading, of ECMWF. It's this one, Caution Men at Work. And it's partly here to say this is work in progress. But it's also partly, well, that's why I looked for it. But then when Googling, I also found this one. So this is just to cheer you all up a little bit. So indeed, this is work in progress to centralize and modularize and kind of give both users, but also the service itself, the possible to have access to pertinent information on extremes in this nimble fashion that we've been talking about, but also just generally have more of an entryway. So one part of, and these are kind of ongoing ideas that we're kind of looking at, and I think this is a good opportunity to also discuss some of these ideas with people in the room, because I think part of these ideas would also need not just internal ECMWF engagement, but general engagement across the community. So one example is to do near real-time updates of the type of catalogs of events that I talked about, that we so to some extent have already, but maybe the event space needs to be changed or updated. And also to have some kind of more faster access to extended information on types of events. This was partly part of the attribution activities. So what do we know about heat waves in Europe without even considering the current event? Instead of having to dive into the IPCC report or old things, you maybe have something a bit closer at hand that you can kind of refer to when you need to, or even just when you get journalist questions, it's nice to have some of those prompts that you can kind of feel like this is what I want to talk about. I already showed a number of tools for looking at extreme event analysis in particular, and I think there is a need to extend some of that within the climate intelligence team, but also looking at so we have a suite, like a set of plots that are produced automatically every month for our monthly monitoring, but to maybe have that at a shorter time scale to also be able to respond more nimbly in a way down that way. But what I think is really important as well is the fitness for purpose of certain data sets to actually do extreme events analysis. So we've seen that for EOPS, for instance, we know that some areas of Europe, there are fewer data sets. We also had examples earlier. I had an example I was going to mention, but now I can't remember which one. We all know that a lot of data sets have limitations, and just to illustrate that, my last slide will be on ERA 5 precipitation, and it's maybe fitness for purpose for extreme events analyses. So this is from a paper by David Davis, a colleague in my group, where we were looking at how can we use ERA 5 precipitation for monitoring, and how can we go beyond, or maybe not go beyond, what we're doing in our monthly bulletin in terms of precipitation so far. And what the top graphic shows, I'm not going to go into the details, but basically where you see red, ERA 5 is relatively good at capturing different types of events. So was it very little rain, kind of normal amount of rain, or really an extreme large amount of rain? So the redder the better, but as you can see across the tropics, this is an example for July, ERA 5 is actually not good at distinguishing between these types of events, which is already an indicator that maybe before diving in too much or doing too much of a statements based on just ERA 5, you need to be a little bit careful. And here is an example on the other hand, on the right, of maybe a more positive example of the European flooding of last year, where ERA 5 captured very well both the location and to some extent also the intensity of the observed rainfall during the flooding in Central Europe. And this is just something we're working on now. So on the Pakistan flooding, just the total average precipitation in August. And I kind of put that there because we wanted to do something and we're working on a web article, but kind of in order to do that quickly, you also have to have this understanding. And I think you can make some of that be part of maybe the EQC activities or even part of a dedicated activity, but ultimately you will almost always have to do some extra analysis if you want to say something about a particular event. And hence my title here, fast at your fingertip, automation will not solve everything. You still need some level of kind of human interaction in the production of those analyses. And with that, I thank you very much.
Questions for Freja? There's two. They're both Dutch. One is a journalist, and the other is not. Who wants to start?
I think you have to wait for the mic.
I'm wondering, what do you think the future will bring? How much sooner you will give journalists an answer in a particular weather event, if it's affected by climate change or not?
So I think there's kind of two parts to this answer. So one, to do like a full attribution analysis. The question is if we will do this at all, or if those groups who are currently doing it will carry on doing those attribution analyses. And then it's down to their time scales, how long that will take. It's usually 10 days to 2 weeks. And in the protocol, which we developed with them, actually was quite difficult to reduce it to very much beyond, let's say, 7 days, 10 days.
Money, even if you had all the money in the people.
I think so, and also you have to
you
say,
need it.
also taking your comment into account, that you want to have the information on embargo maybe for 2 days before it's public. Those 2 days also count.
Of course, yeah.
So I think
Okay.
that's. I mean, just to kind of illustrate, I think that's why it's so important to have those workflows also kind of panned out, because then you see black on white, there is quite some time additions almost in every step you do, and some of those steps are not easy to reduce.
I love how you
Thank
made
you.
timing a shared responsibility with the journalists, Freja. Gerard.
I was wondering about one of your confidential results.
There's a journalist in the room, Gerard.
You showed the database of extreme events,
Yeah.
and that's very interesting, of course, to build. But I think there's already something being done by the DWD, the German Weather Service, in their Kroner database. So how does this relate to this, I think, WMO activity?
Well, so in this particular case, the idea was to have a database of events that had been studied within that attribution service that didn't now materialize. And that would be everything from, we tried to analyze this event, but due to manpower, lack of data, whatever, we didn't. Or we did study event, but due to XYZ, we didn't have a conclusive answer, or due to we did have a conclusive answer, and that would then be in there. So that was the idea of that catalog, to kind of fill it up with the event studies and potentially also back in time. So that was that's why we started building that catalog. But I think that catalog will also maybe inform if we go down the route of having other catalogs, and there is indeed the question of how would such catalogs interact with the one at DWD.
Thanks a lot, Freja.